Until the 17th century, most of the great physicians and anatomists were interested in the respiratory muscles and the mechanics of breathing. Since then, these muscles have been increasingly neglected, lying as they do in a no-man's land between anatomy and physiology. I've not dealt with the use of the respiratory muscles in speech and singing. Studies of these problems demand a much better knowledge of the basic respiratory function of the muscles than at present exists.
Carl Stow took up the challenge of exploring that no-man's land, searching for answers. Because of his discoveries about the respiratory muscles in speech and singing, we now have a better knowledge of the mechanics of breathing.
All life begins and ends with the exhale. The first sound a newborn makes occurs on the first exhale. That sound triggers the perpetual motion of the diaphragm. There is a right and wrong way to breathe. The diaphragm is designed to work with maximum efficiency and minimum effort. Many people are doing the opposite. This situation can start at a very early age, with children holding their breaths. This weakens the diaphragm and eventually destroys the natural coordination. But to regain that coordination is to improve the quality of life.
Well, to be a 19-year-old struck down with encephalitis, to be crippled, to be having to learn basic motor skills once again, if that was even going to be possible. This was the position I was in, and I think literally breathing coordination breathed new life into me, that you can excel, you can overcome, you can excel what has happened before, beyond what has happened before. I didn't know whether I would regain all of my intelligence. I didn't know whether I would regain all of my motor abilities. And to think of not having found breathing coordination, to me, is to think I would be a cripple today.
Throughout his life and career, Carl Stow has had a unique ability to visualize. His added gifts of a phenomenal ear for sound and a heightened sense of touch made possible the discoveries that followed. While a student at Westminster Choir College, Stow dreamed of one day having his own choir school where he could develop natural voices. Upon graduation, he was given that opportunity at the First Presbyterian Church in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. He developed choirs of all ages. His unique approach was to give individual voice lessons to each of his choir members. Within 10 weeks, they performed Part 1 of Handel's Messiah with the North Carolina Symphony. This led to many acclaimed performances, including The Lost Colony, a symphonic drama, and finally his own weekly choral program on the Liberty Radio Network. Success in radio brought him to New York, where he revived the Good Shepherd Choir School in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. His choirs, comprised of more than 200 voices, young and old, performed throughout the metropolitan area, including the 1964 World's Fair and in Radio City Music Hall. By a curious twist of fate, Stau's success at developing natural voices attracted the attention of Dr. Maurice Small. He was the chief of tuberculosis management at East Orange, New Jersey Veterans Hospital. In the late 1950s, hospitals had wards full of patients with a newly diagnosed disease called emphysema. None of the standard treatments had any positive effect. "You must know something about breathing that we don't," Dr. Small told Stau. "If you can help just one person, it would be a major medical breakthrough." After a long period of hesitation, Stau agreed to a 2-month trial.
I knew nothing. And to walk in and be shown a ward of patients dying with emphysema, gasping for every breath, is not describable. And I had no idea I could do anything at all to help these patients. But being left alone with a patient, my instincts took over, and I found myself touching the chest because the chest was rigid and I knew it shouldn't be. And by touching the chest, I think the very fact of contact even made the patient feel as if somebody cared enough to begin to try. And I was able to gradually release some of the tension in the chest, and in doing that, to slide the rib cage a little lower. And there was a definite reaction of some relief by the patient, who then tried to thank me, but of course when he tried to talk, everything just locked back up again. But with my background and with the fact that I had dealt with voice, I thought if this person could make maybe one vowel sound without the chest locking in the process, he might be able to improve.
Encouraged by Stau's ideas, Dr. Small also showed him his first fluoroscope, an actual photograph of the diaphragm. Although it lasted only a few seconds, it offered Stau a revealing insight into this organ and its important function.
This then led to the very core of what the work later became about, and that was whether it was possible to develop this diaphragm enough to rise high enough inside the rib cage to release the ribs and support pressure to make speaking sound. This turned out to be the key of all the work that followed, because in effect I had discovered a form of an isometric exercise for a totally involuntary muscle organ. So I was taken to a pulmonary laboratory, which I had never been, and to my horror found out that every single study they were doing was forced breathing. You would blow into a tank, which was called spirometry, and measure how much air you could get out in the first section. Of course, the patient would just lock up completely and be gasping. So I realized that it, again, like most things in life, had to do with a balance. How much effort could you make without having an adverse effect?
Dr. Small realized the standard procedure tests at East Orange were too gross to measure the work Stau was doing. By this time, young pulmonary doctors at the Philadelphia Naval Hospital had heard about Stau's success. They invited him to come to work with their emphysema patients.
And by this time, I had the responsibility of, if I withdrew, these people were going to die. That's a very difficult thing to live with. It wasn't a matter like, I can refer this to somebody else, they can do it, because it was either I saw them or nobody saw them.
At Philadelphia, Stau also learned about the use of oxygen and medications. In East Orange, most of the patients were treated with oxygen. He had some success reducing the amount of oxygen they required. But at Philadelphia, the doctors used no oxygen at all. They had found it could have a suffocating effect.
The medications primarily were nothing but to try to dilate the bronchial tubes or to kill infection. And of course, it was all just a holding pattern with no basic improvement in the patient. Also, while I was in Philadelphia, I was put in touch with a book that was the first book written on what was called mechanics of breathing by an English doctor, where he said that this work was definitely in a no man's land between anatomy and physiology. Well, I think that statement, not that I really thought of myself in those terms, but I really knew I was in a no man's land, but most of my life had been in a no man's land. But it was comforting, at least, to know that it wasn't a matter of anyone really understanding. It was a matter that we were all trying to learn together.
Eventually, the doctors associated with Stowe left the Navy and the hospital. Because of the interest in the unexplained success he was achieving, his research was transferred to the largest naval hospital on the East Coast, St. Albans in New York City.
This was exciting because the doctors immediately said, you must be changing the diaphragm. I really hadn't thought that much about diaphragm. All I cared about was if I could release the chest and if the patient felt better. And so they started to do inhale, exhale, x-rays. Before I worked with the patient and after I worked with the patient, and the reality was that yes, the diaphragm was increasing in an excursion. This had never been thought possible. And this led to another incredible discovery, which was by the use of a new device called cinefluorography, where they actually photographed, cine meaning film, what was going on inside the body. It was to study the heart, other internal organs. But with this progress I had, these doctors said, let's see if we can study the diaphragm for the first time in history. Now we're talking about the main, largest muscle organ of the body, which was totally overlooked because they all thought nothing could be done about it. Yet the entire pressure of the body, the internal pressure, circulation, blood gases, all depend on how much air can get out so that you can inhale. Everything is based on the exhale, not the inhale. Everyone is saying, take a breath, take a breath. Well, you can't take a breath if you can't exhale the amount of air in the lung. I also learned about residual volume there. Residual volume is the amount of air left in the lung at the end of an exhale. And all infection starts in residual volume, what is called dead spaces of the lung. And if the diaphragm isn't strong enough to rise high enough to push out the stale air, you just get one infection after another. The cinefluorography showed that definitely it was possible to redevelop this diaphragm, and in doing so, it actually changed its structure. This was rather overwhelming because, first of all, they said you have really opened Pandora's box here because this carries into every major medical problem that exists today because everything has to do with oxygen level or a buildup of CO2 in the body. Secondly, who is going to rewrite the textbooks? Thirdly, the nice thing for me was they said, you know, this could not have happened if you had been one of us, because our point of reference is wrong.
Word of the new research kept spreading, and Stowe was contacted by the Veterans Administration Hospital in West Haven, Connecticut. Their facility had a permanent staff and the largest outpatient clinic for respiratory disease on the East Coast.
So an appointment was made for me to go to West Haven to meet with the chief of pulmonary disease. And when I got there, he called in the head of the pulmonary laboratory, Dr. Robert Nims. And they looked at me and said, what exactly is it that you do? And I said, well, I was returning the patients to a more normal way of breathing. And they said, well, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, if you don't know what normal breathing is, how are you going to know what I do? How are you going to know if I make improvements in that direction?" I think this was rather a shock for them as well as for me, because I didn't realize that there was no standard for what correct breathing was. I thought that certainly the medical profession had some idea of knowing if a person was breathing that well or not.
Clinically, physicians taking care of people with pulmonary disease feel that they can do nothing to directly affect the diaphragm. They treat infection of the lungs to minimize the obstruction of air and let the lungs collapse as much as they can and pull the diaphragm up. They don't work directly on the diaphragm.
So that when I got to West Haven, they said, "Well, now wait a minute here. In order to really have a controlled medical study, you have to have patients that you work with and patients that have other treatment." And for this particular thing, they had picked using intermittent pressure machines. Well, I was rather distressed because, first of all, I couldn't exactly imagine me against the machines. And secondly, I had known that there was, when pressure was used to breathe, it would tend to throw out everything that I had done. I had found this out with just the pulmonary laboratories. But the study was set up, and the medical profession, I think, wanted these machines to be successful because at that particular time, with all the attention drawn to emphysema, they really had nothing else. Unfortunately for them, within 6 months, although the study was supposed to run 2 years, some of their patients had died, and several of mine were able to go out of the hospital.
These machines actually were a negative factor. They have entirely gone out of use after a study about 15 years ago, a study of many hospitals and probably several hundred patients showing that they did no good.
The test was brought to a close, and a whole series of other things came about. You know, it wasn't until many years later that I realized they were not really doing studies to prove me right. They were doing studies to prove me wrong.
I told Carl in no uncertain words that he was mildly demented, if I may say so, to say that he could affect a rise in the diaphragm and a descent in the ribs. But then, in one patient, we got rather spectacular results showing that he did do this. Now, what this means is that when Carl affects a coordination of all of the groups of breathing muscles and the individual breathing muscles, including the diaphragm and the abdomen and those around the neck and the throat, why the air can flow out of these areas which remain obstructed under every other circumstance. And we have shown that he is able to decrease the volume of the lungs more than any pulmonary man would say was possible. And the function of the diaphragm redeveloped. And Carl refers to this quite correctly as redevelopment or development of the diaphragm. Now, many studies that have been done in the last 5 years have been done at the wrong end of the spectrum. They've studied how forcibly the diaphragm can pull down an inspiration. That's not the important thing. The important thing is what Carl has shown, that the diaphragm can be gotten to relax and go up, to rise, so that during inspiration it can come down. It's got plenty of strength. You don't need to measure the strength.
I also learned about respiratory faults. Now, respiratory fault is an abnormality. I knew it as an abnormality because with the emphysema patients, all their chests were raised and tight, but there is a joint right in the sternum, the breastbone, at the second rib, and it's a cartilage joint and it's for flexibility. But if that If you use what is called accessory breathing, where you use the muscles of the upper chest and the shoulders and you grab for a breath, you pull on this joint and it lifts the chest on the inhale, and the diaphragm will tend to slip underneath it, and when the diaphragm tries to rise, it will hit the bottom of the rib cage and make the ribs flare. This is called a respiratory fault, and it was thought impossible to reverse it. Once you had it, that was it. Well, of course, that was true if you couldn't redevelop the diaphragm. But as I was able to redevelop the diaphragm, and the diaphragm started going up inside the rib cage started to release around it, and the joint in the sternum became more straight, and even there was possibility to straighten some of the flare at the bottom of the ribs.
So with the inspiration-expiration films, the pneumographs, the cinefluorography, and the Röntgen chimograph, and the vital capacity otherwise, which is a part of what's called spirometry, all showed the same results. Each test confirmed each of the others and demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that the severely damaged lungs of the emphysema patient can in fact exhale the air that the medical profession had been thoroughly convinced was stuck in the lungs, blocked in the lungs, and that the muscles of breathing, all of the muscles of breathing, from those high in the throat, the shoulders, the ribs, the diaphragm, and the abdomen, all can be resynchronized so that the patient can breathe, firstly, with much less oxygen cost in the act of breathing. Fighting against obstruction or fighting against his own discoordination and asynchrony is very costly in terms of oxygen use. But quiet breathing that Carl establishes is much less costly, much more efficient.
Now, of course, the voice was the important thing all the way through. The whole way to redevelop the diaphragm was for the diaphragm to be able to produce enough pressure to make sound without tensing. This was actually what developed the diaphragm. But no one much paid attention to voice, other than my own ear. But here we started getting voices that totally changed as the diaphragm developed.
And we also did cinefluorography, which was taking movies of a fluoroscopic screen. And we showed the movement of the diaphragm and the movement of the ribs, and then projected these on a screen and took tracings of them, and were able to show the synchronization of the lungs and the diaphragm. And that is particularly dramatic because it's very easy for one to see.
These films, owned by the Stow Institute, are the only cinefluorography films of the human diaphragm that exist in medical history. They document how the respiratory system is designed.
What you are seeing here is two X-rays. The one on the right is the inhale, and you can see the lungs are full of air, and the diaphragm, which is the line at the bottom, that is the top of the diaphragm, is sitting very low. On the left, you are seeing the X-ray with the diaphragm now on the exhale stage and rising very high, pushing the air out of the lung. What you saw just a minute ago on the bottom, from the front, the maximum inhale, and on the left, the maximum exhale. The two X-rays at the top are very rarely done, again, because the one on the right is, again, the maximum inhale, and the one on the left, the maximum exhale. Now, what is fascinating here is the difference in the width of the body. When the lungs are full of air, you can see very clearly how it changes the entire shape of the body. And people don't realize how large the lungs are. They think the lungs are right in the front of them, right at the chest. But you see, there's actually more lung tissue at the back than in the front. So here you have maximum excursion of the diaphragm. This is over 12 centimeters of motion. Normal is usually considered around 8, and most people on the street are lucky if they have more than 3. But this is maximum diaphragmatic motion that you're seeing. What you are seeing here has never before been seen. You are actually seeing inside a person's body and seeing the diaphragm rise, which it has done now. In fact, it's off the top of the screen. There it is reflected into the inhale, and now it's rising on the exhale. This again is maximum excursion. This is like the x-rays that you saw previously of over 12 centimeters of motion. The lines that you're seeing crisscrossing are the ribs in the front and the back. There the diaphragm again goes into the inhale, and as you can see, it takes longer for the exhale than the inhale. Now this is relaxed normal breathing for a person whose diaphragm is this strong to have this kind of motion. We'll have the same thing now on the left side. Again, you can see the heart beating, and they move the camera to show you how far that excursion goes. Now, diaphragm has risen, and we will wait now. There's the next inhale. They move the camera, and you can see how far the diaphragm has descended on the inhale. The motion of the diaphragm is totally the result of its strength. If the diaphragm is weak, as we'll see later, there's very little motion, but this is maximum motion. Now we have an emphysema patient with minimum diaphragmatic motion. And as you can see, the diaphragm is not even clearly defined now. In fact, part of the diaphragm on the side is going down while part near the center is going up. That is called paradoxical motion. And the diaphragm is very diffused. It's not clearly outlined. That is because when the diaphragm weakens, it actually slightly deteriorates. And you can see that it does not have the same. Now the patient is trying to breathe fast, as if he were walking. You can see the diaphragm is just not turning air over at all. So he would be then going into accessory breathing and gasping. You have the same patient now and seeing the diaphragm from the left side. Again, the shadow on the whitey part toward the left top part of the screen is the heartbeat. And again, here the diaphragm is a little more clearly defined than it was on the right side. But you see when he tries to exhale how the diaphragm just sort of flutters. And of course, the minimum turnover of air makes him gasp. Also, if you can see the side, you can see the ribs are going paradoxically as well. That means that rather when the diaphragm is descending on an inhale, the ribs are coming in rather than going out. So everything is backwards. All of this has to be corrected in order for the patient to have relaxed breathing. This is Mr. Cannon when I first got him. He was an advanced emphysema patient. In fact, he was a bed patient. You can see that his breathing is what we call accessory breathing. That is that on every inhale, he is lifting the chest, the shoulders sit high, and when that happens, here we are seeing the neck. The neck tenses on every inhale as he grabs for breath. All of these pictures were taken to show the abnormalities of how the breathing process goes when it is reversed. Here we have the front of the chest, and the chest is pulling on every inhale, and on every exhale, rather than the abdomen contracting, it's expanding, so that he pulls air in at the top and then pushes for the exhale. This picture is showing the same thing from the back ribs, how the back ribs are pulling on each inhale rather than opening, and how at the very bottom, again, there is protrusion on the exhale. We have still Mr. Cannon, and this is the way his diaphragm looked when he was gasping. In other words, he even has a weak spot through it, as you can see from the dark shadow. He has minimum amount of motion, is diffused, and rather than having the ribs fold around the diaphragm on the exhale, they pull in on the inhale. So again, he has that same kind of paradoxical. Now you can really see when he tries to breathe fast, as he would do if he were walking, how he is getting almost no turnover of air whatsoever. This is the same from the left, only as you can see the diaphragm is even weaker on the left and very diffused. So he's getting a minimum amount of motion. And you can also see how the ribs are going backwards. In other words, on every inhale, rather than the rib cage opening at the bottom, it's contracting at the bottom. The pulsating is the heartbeat. You can see how fast his heart is beating by the the pulsation and how the diaphragm almost feels as if it's not doing anything at all. There we get it into a slight inhale, and you can see how diffused it is. It almost looks like soap bubbles. When I first got Mr. Cannon, of course, he couldn't walk like this at all. This would be about after the first 3 or 4 months. And Mr. Cannon now has just gotten well enough that he can do a minimum amount of walking without totally reverting the breathing. But as you see, when he sits, the shoulders go very, very high. This is Mr. Cannon with the cinephagraphy film on the left after I have worked with him for a number of months. I would think this would be actually much later than 3 months, or this is probably around 6 months later. And you can see that the diaphragm is more clearly defined now. Even the heartbeat is slower. It's not pounding as hard. And he does have some paradoxical motion of the ribs, but not like before. And the diaphragm, although it is moving slowly, has much more shape to it. It's not like the soap bubbles that we originally saw. And this is why he has improved. Now he is breathing fast, as he would if he walked, and it's not totally diffused as it was before. It is greatly improved. Now we have Mr. Cannon way past 6 months, and this is when I left him, and he was able to go out of the hospital on weekends. In fact, he's gotten, as you can see, he will smile a little bit, and he is walking with quite a jaunty walk. This is Mr. Cannon when we saw before the neck how it was pulled. Now it is staying relaxed, and his breathing is not gasping. He has been able to revert the entire pattern to a normal, coordinated way of breathing. This is the front of Mr. Cannon, and of course he has gained considerable weight. When you are gasping, you can't swallow, so you can't eat. And he has been able to put on a number of pounds, and now, as you can see, the abdomen is not going paradoxically. The back, of course, is very changed as well. You don't have every rib sticking out as you did before. He still has some pull on the inhale, but not the way it was from the beginning. And as you see, we have a different person altogether. His life has totally changed. From being a bedridden patient, he is now able to leave the hospital and drive himself home. During these years, there were similar results with hundreds of patients. All this improvement was the result of being able to redevelop the diaphragm enough to improve the respiratory faults and increase the oxygen level. This is Mrs. Elber, a former nurse and the young mother of a 3-year-old daughter caught in this terrible situation of endless gasping. And even this could be corrected enough for her to be able to breathe comfortably. Now, if all these patients with emphysema could improve, think what a person without respiratory disease can do to increase his breathing. Just to refresh your memories, this is the goal. This picture is of a healthy diaphragm in maximum excursion.
As the research at West Haven concluded, Stowe now saw how his work could be applied to all people, not just those with respiratory disease. A major turning point came with a call from the U.S. Olympic Committee.
The Olympic Committee was planning to have their next Olympics in Mexico City with high altitude. There had never been athletes in high altitude. Everyone was concerned about oxygen debt. At a symposium, they decided they wanted me to do a preliminary study. So I worked with the Boys Club in New York and the Yale track and field team. One of the boys I worked with at the Boys Club won the Golden Gloves title, while another won the marathon. The Olympics was interested in warm-up and recovery. The Yale team not only showed a decrease in the time of warm-up and recovery, but they also won the heptagonals. I was approved by the medical board of the Olympic Committee in 2 weeks.
The importance of breathing at altitude was quickly apparent as we began our training sessions at the 7,200-foot level in Echo Summit Training Center at Lake Tahoe. It was under the expert tutelage of Carl Stow that our athletes learned to develop their breathing coordination. They quickly found that they could release tensions, handle greater workloads, and have better recovery.
When I started working with these athletes, the most amazing thing to me was their awarenesses. I could make the slightest adjustment and they could feel it all through their bodies. Also, the most wonderful thing was that they had awareness of back motion. Now, when the diaphragm rises on the exhale, neurologically, you go into the inhale, and because the diaphragm is attached at the spine, you have motion of the spine in the small of the back. And the athletes learned that if they went to the track and they would concentrate on an exhale, which they would do by counting silently, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth, without sound, and they never paid any attention to where they were, that would extend the exhale long enough that automatically they would have the reflex inhale and feel the back motion. So as long as they could feel the back was loose, they didn't go into an oxygen debt. One example of an athlete who had tremendous awareness was runner Lee Evans. When he reached altitude, he experienced a painful burning in his chest. But with his awareness, we were able to correct the faults, and he went on to win gold medals while also setting the world record.
Through my work with Dr. Stowe, I knew I had to exhale, you know. I exhaled, which kept my energy up. I didn't get tired, you know, and I understood it very well. At the finish of the 400-meter race, your body is screaming for air. But if you don't exhale, are you just putting bad air on top of bad air? So the exhale, I think, is what saved me. But after the game, I found that this was for my life, not just to help me to break the world record, but I could use this technique the rest of my life.
In the end, the Olympic team had won more gold medals than in the history of the Olympics, and were the only team not to have to use oxygen. This, I think, was due to their incredible awareness. And about this time, I had another challenge that showed incredible awareness where there thought there was none. I had a young girl, 10 years old, who had paralysis from the neck down. She had no sensation of hot or cold. She couldn't talk a sentence. She could only say a few words. The wonderful thing is that when I started working with her, she had an actual awareness of her diaphragm. She could feel how it was working, and in time, I developed her to the place that she could speak perfectly normal sentences. She learned to sing. She had always wanted to sing. She had never sung in her life. Now, her breathing had gotten so well controlled that she learned to write and paint with a stick in her mouth. And she made me this lovely Christmas card with a stick in her mouth that I have always cherished. Side, there you go. Head up nice and tall, Doran. There you go. All right, perfect. And we're going to do 5.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Doran was a 12-year-old boy from England whose mother heard about Stow's work and brought her son to see him. Doran was born with brain damage. The doctors were not sure he would live. When Stow saw him, Doran's breathing was deteriorating. Stow set out to redevelop his diaphragm over a 2-week period.
He again had remarkable awareness. His speech improved. He was less spastic. He could sit and let his feet and hands just hang. For the first time, he was able to pick up a knife and fork and eat and spoon and eat. He also was able to sing. When he went to the park, he got lost among the other children because being spastic didn't show. He also could go up 2 and 3 flights of stairs without being short of breath.
Stow has treated many different diseases and respiratory faults. His mastery of breathing coordination is enabling people to gain awareness and to overcome their difficulties. An extraordinary example is jazz musician David Sanborn, who had polio as a child.
I think if I had not gotten involved in this process, I probably would have experienced a gradual deterioration of my, playing ability. I think that I was at a point right before I started to see Carl where I was really starting to experience shortness of breath all the time, and I was having to compensate more and more physically for my inability to turn air over. I feel a real coordination between mind and body. And I think that, in any kind of physical endeavor, whether you're a basketball player or a musician or whatever endeavor you're involved in, but particularly something that's as physical as what I do, that being able to not have to think about that interface between the mental and the physical is the most profound. So that when I play on stage, when I perform, whether it's live or in a recording studio, I'm able to eliminate any kind of conscious thought about what goes from my mind and my emotions through my body, that I'm able to express myself to a much freer degree, uninhibited by an awareness of any physical limitations.
One of the most widespread problems diagnosed today is asthma. It can even affect opera singers, such as renowned soprano Lauren Flanagan.
The first thing that comes to mind when trying to describe asthma is if you take a sense of claustrophobia and you multiply it, like 100-fold, and you attach to that a physical tightening of your own body and a restriction of all of your muscles, that's what it would be like. It's like everything coming in closer and closer in on you and your inability to break out of that. And so you end up, I think, to demonstrate what you do is you end up lifting up higher and higher, and then you kind of place your hands on your hips because you're almost trying to separate, your hips from your ribs. And then I noticed that some people would place their arms on something to try to lift them up, and you'll notice their shoulders are getting higher and higher, and it's because your body's really unable to expel everything, and so it's unable to inhale again on top of that. So it's just becoming shallower and shallower and shallower, and then the tighter the muscles get, you can't really undo that. And the one thing, you can't undo it with massage therapy. I tried. You really can't counteract the effects of this with massage. It really is I don't know, I really think it's a thing about the diaphragm. I was attracted to the projects that expressed grief more than humor, because that was the only thing I could see my way into. And now my voice now can express humor and joy, and my need is there also. Whereas before, even if I wanted to, I couldn't do it. It was still, it became purely technical.
In addition to asthma, the rib cage and diaphragm can be affected by any number of physical, emotional, and environmental causes.
I'm an artist. I have curvature of the spine, scoliosis. I have a steel rod in my spine. And for years I studied all kinds of alignment techniques to sort of help me with my posture. And then what Carl taught me basically was to pay attention to your breathing, to not force it. I had been forcing all my life. I had been trying to overcome my spinal problem by brute force. I pull this shoulder forward. I pull my neck over this way. And that means that I don't have enough room for my diaphragm to move up. And I didn't realize that before. Now, when I notice it, I say, oh, that's right. I gotta give some room for my diaphragm. And I can move my shoulder back, and I can ease up my neck, and I can start to breathe.
The explanation that Carl was able to give to me about the importance of the exhale opened a huge door in my mind. Because here I had spent now 8 months gasping, thinking all my thought was, how can I get the air in? I even had frights that at night maybe I wouldn't be able to get the air in, and I was just going to suffocate. And he said something important to me, that an inhale is always going to happen. The importance is to get the air out and use the diaphragm for its proper function, which is to get that air out and relieve that pressure that's in there.
When I went to Carl, when I first arrived in his office, what you see here, this, which is at this level up here, the top 5 ribs, were actually sitting up about this high at that time. They were incredibly much higher. The left rib cage did not come around as it does now. The ribs 8, 9, and 10 on the left side did not come around as they are now, but they came out from the back and they literally went out like this. They never even wrapped around to the front. The whole rib cage was highly foreshortened. It was much, much, much higher than it is now, and much, much wider, the whole rib cage. And the back had a very severe sway in it, very severe, which is non-existent now, plus somewhat of a scoliosis. All of this is completely gone.
So many times people will ask me, well, what can I do to help myself? And I always come up with pretty much the same answer. Stop holding your breath. And many people will say, well, I don't hold my breath. And then they realize that they do. This starts with children. Children, if they're called upon and they feel that they are in the limelight and they feel self-conscious, the first thing they do is go and lock. In my choir school, they had to memorize tremendous amount of words, and I would go around and each one would say the word independently, and I'd get to a child and he wasn't sure. So he would just lock and hold, and I'd just pat them on the shoulder and say, it's all right, you know it. And that's the other thing. You must watch the shoulders. People will sit with their shoulders up. They will prop. All of this is pulling everything out of alignment. It's not a matter of sitting perfectly straight all the time. It's a matter you have to watch these things, particularly athletes running. Athletes running have to be very careful not to raise the shoulders, and there are tricks they can do. In other words, you can just touch your middle finger and your thumb when you run so that the shoulders will hang, so you can tell if you have tension in the arms. The other thing is sound. People don't sing anymore. Now, it's not any kind of sound I'm talking about. Yelling and screaming is one of the worst things. It is a sound that is the result of how the air pressure is made in the lung to pass the air over the glottis. It is the coordination. It is communication. In today's world, there is so much carbon dioxide building up in the world, let alone within the individual. And every time that you are holding your breath, you are building up more CO2. This affects the whole nervous system. Oxygen relaxes muscles and nerves. Carbon dioxide tenses muscles and nerves. Today, what goes for stress, and that is the big thing, is people not exhaling, not keeping the rhythm of breathing going, and that is not blowing. I will see athletes and people working out in gyms and they're blowing. When you blow, you make pressure on the respiratory system, on the esophagus, on everything inside the lung, and it closes. You want to keep everything open. As I said before, with runners, they would run and phonate silently. 1, 2, 3. The reason for that is when you have jaw motion and tongue motion, the throat stays open. People carry tremendous tension in their jaws, in their tongue, in their neck, in their shoulders. That is the result of the sternal angle. But again, if you count silently, at the very end of the exhale, you can add the slightest bit of pressure right on that joint at the second rib and flatten the chest, and the inhale will come in neurologically every single time. And the people will say, well, I don't feel like I'm breathing. If they don't feel like they're breathing, it's because they're used to grabbing and forcing and pushing. There are so many things that are so simple. Get your children singing again. Get them away from the television set. Get them away from the computers all the time. I have people who have to work in these areas, and I tell you, at least talk to yourself when you're doing the computer. Keep the exhales going. Some people don't even realize that sound is made on the exhale. I don't know how they can make it on the inhale, but they have never thought about it.
But one of the breathing exercises that I like the most is the one where you make vowel sounds, and you see how long you can extend the sound, and you pick up the clarity of your sound. And I know Carl had explained to me at one point when I asked him, you know, how come I feel so wonderful? I mean, just so vibrant and alive and great when I when I make these sounds. And he said, well, everybody's voice is their personal signature, and that when you hit the center of your sound, you have a kind of resonating frequency. And when you hit that resonating frequency, it causes all the internal organs, I mean, down to your cells and your molecules, to kind of resonate.
I don't know why. There's my theory is that it's preventive medicine. And we don't spend a lot of time in preventive medicine. A friend of mine says one of the problems with our present, quote, health system is that it's a disease model, not a wellness model. But I think because of things like AIDS and the amounts of cancers and the environmental diseases that are coming about, the allergies, more and more people are looking for ways of prevention.
Exhale.
The future is exciting. Our society needs breathing coordination now more than ever. A new science, respiratory science, has been discovered. Designated practitioners in related fields are beginning to incorporate breathing coordination principles in their own work, and a large number of people with respiratory problems are being helped.
Open the mouth. The breathing coordination made an enormous change in my life as a tool for combating stress. I totally reject all notions of a split between body, mind, and spirit. And I really do believe that the body can influence the mind tremendously. So I take my calming effect from the body first with the breathing coordination.
The crucial issue for people is to understand how to be in relationship to themselves before they can be in relationship with others. And you cannot do that if you're not in relationship to your breath. So I use Carl's work and the breathing work as the entrance in. And that helps dispel our fear. It helps dispel our separation from other people. It helps dispel all the barriers that we have that prevent us from moving forward in our life.
When I got people as clients, I tended to work on their breathing because it was so wonderful when Carl worked on me, and the breathing coordination was such a sort of a sense of coming home for me. It's like, this is it. I found it. This is what I want. This is what this is how I want to be. This is also, it seems, what I want to do.
I had been in a car accident when I was 17, and I hit the dashboard with my throat. I wasn't wearing a seatbelt at that time. So I whiplashed here, I pulled my lower back out, and I cut myself here. And I was put on vocal rest. I was told not to speak for a few weeks at the end of high school. So I recuperated. I got better, but I never felt right. I had neck pain, I had lower back pain. My voice was just, didn't have any real resonance to it. And training in the technique brought me a lot further along. But it wasn't until I saw Carl that I got the fullness, the three-dimensional quality of my body that helped to support my sound and helped to release muscles that I was still holding on to on a very unconscious level, but I was still holding on to them. So what Carl was doing was giving me the experience of of my torso being three-dimensional and of a sense of lengthening and widening without pushing or pulling, just allowing it to happen. And you can begin to play.
We're sort of the culture of where the West was won. How did we win the West? We threw our shoulders together, we lifted our chest, we tightened our abdominals, and gung-ho ahead. There are many cultures in the world where this is not the natural order of things. And you see this in children. You can see it very early in children. They are all perfectly coordinated, and then as soon as they stand up and start to move, they see whoever, daddy and mommy, is raising them. Oh, they're like sponges. It's all very nonverbal. You're not even being told at that age to stand up straight. That comes later. That's reinforcement. But very early on, you see everywhere in the culture this pattern, which is repeated. Okay.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
To convince them that you don't have to use these muscles up here to get the sound out, that yes, you're going to use your abdominal muscles, but how much do you need to use the abdominal muscles if you're strengthening your diaphragm? Less is more.
I have had experiences on my table, and the people that I have known over the years who have worked on their breathing, who have understood it, and their lives have changed. Their lives have changed because they have been able to use what God gave them. Happiness is a result of making the most of whatever you have with your talents. That requires having all your senses and making the most of your senses. Then you know what you are best qualified for, and that is what you will do the best, and there is the happiness and the change in your life that everyone is seeking.
I knew that as much as I wanted to work on finding myself or finding, the universe through me, or however you want to express it, I had the door when I had breathing coordination.
And it connects me to that. I don't get so lost into all the stupid things that people are telling me to do or that I'm supposed to be thinking about. The breathing coordination, I think, keeps me aligned with what truly I want to do next.
It meant that I was able to use my natural voice instead of trying to contrive a sound that I thought would, sell records or whatever. I was able just to actually use my voice as an instrument and sing freely, and it was a great sense of freedom.
I heard a voice coming from myself, but it seemed to come from the room as if it echoed off the walls. And I heard it from outside, a voice that I had always wanted to meet, a voice I had always wanted to hear.
This is an amazing, totally simple, totally inexpensive way to, to come home to the now. And I think that's where nature really wants us to live.